Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Shannon Price Minter, the Legal Director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights and one of the nation's leading advocacy groups for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered people. Minter has been lead counsel in dozens of groundbreaking legal victories for the LGBT community. He serves on the boards of Faith in America and the Transgender Law and Policy Institute, and has previously served on the American Bar Association Commission on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. Minter gave a talk titled Marriage and More, the Future of the LGBT Rights Movement, as a guest of the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics on October 3rd, 2013. Shannon, thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
The Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act on June 26, 2013. Describe the importance of that decision.
Well, it really is groundbreaking for the LGBT movement. This is the third time in history of the court that it has issued a positive decision about the gay rights movement, or gay people, really. The first big decision was Romer versus Evans, when the court struck down a Colorado proposed constitutional amendment that would have prevented the state from ever enacting protections for gay people. So that was about discrimination. Then the court edged a little closer to the arena that Windsor touched on in Lawrence v. Texas, where the court finally held that states cannot criminalize same-sex intimacy or same-sex relationships. But it's only with the Windsor decision that the court for the first time has said that legally married same-sex couples have a constitutionally protected right to recognition and to what the court called, quote-unquote, equal dignity. So we've gone kind of a far ways down the road of having, the Supreme Court recognize that same-sex couples are entitled to the same legal protections and social recognition and status as heterosexual couples.
So what are the ongoing challenges of achieving marriage equality across the nation?
Well, we still are living in a world where only 12 states and the District of Columbia, as well as 5 Native American tribes, actually permit same-sex couples to marry. So still most of the country does not. And most of the states that don't let same-sex couples marry actually have passed state constitutional amendments barring marriage for same-sex couples. So the only avenue for challenging all of those laws is in federal court. So that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing, after the Windsor decision kind of gave a big boost to the marriage equality effort, we're seeing suits happening all across the country in federal court challenging the 31 marriage bans that are still in place.
Sometimes in this debate in the public forum, people say there's an argument about equal rights and special rights. Can you describe what that argument is about and what that distinction means?
Well, I've never really quite understood the argument that when gay people are seeking, exactly the same protections and kind of very fundamental rights that other people enjoy, how anyone could characterize that as seeking special rights. I think it kind of just boils down to the argument that gay people shouldn't have the same protections as others, and that there's something somehow, I guess sort of metaphysically different about gay people, such that the burden should be on gay people to justify why they're entitled to the same rights as other people. It's really, I think, a really intellectually kind of empty argument. It's one that we don't hear that often anymore, and I think one of the reasons we don't hear it as often as we used to is precisely because the visibility of the fight for marriage equality. It's kind of difficult to construe marriage as a special right, since it is something that is so universally available.
The title of the talk that you're giving at the Morse Center is Marriage and More, the Future of the LGBT Rights Movement. Can you give us a sense of how you see the future of the movement?
Yes, I am very optimistic about the future of the movement. I mean, it's a little bit premature in some ways to be having this discussion for the reasons we just said. We have by no means yet achieved nationwide marriage equality, but the momentum is so clearly pushing in that direction, and it looks like with all the cases out there brewing in federal court that we'll probably have a case back in front of the U.S. Supreme Court in maybe 3 years. And I think that most people believe, I certainly do, that when that issue is presented to the court, they are going to hold that, yes, same-sex couples have the same right to marry as anyone else. So I don't want to be, overly counting our chickens before they're hatched, but the very imminence of that happening is starting to spur very serious discussions about, well, what's the LGBT movement going to look like after that? Some people are very worried, actually, that without the pressure of the visibility and momentum that the marriage equality movement has generated, that maybe we'll see the movement sort of diminish, or that the community will lose interest, that people won't be engaged, they won't be contributing money, and that they may not care about the issues that are still so prevalent and important, not just for gay people, but for other people. High rates of poverty and violence in the transgender community, for example. Homelessness among LGBT youth, still a very big issue. We still don't have federal employment protections. Then there's issues that affect all of us, like just the incredibly high rates of incarceration in the U.S., which the gay movement has begun to address those issues. So that's the worry, that's the issue. Are those concerns well-founded? Is there a real danger that the movement will kind of lose its force and, maybe not wither and die, but become greatly diminished once we've achieved this very visible goal of marriage equality?
Can you tell us what led you to your advocacy for LGBT rights?
Yes, it was, for me, it was very personal. I do just want to say before we move on to that I want to be clear that I do not share that concern about the movement. I don't see that happening. I see every sign that the LGBT community is going to stay highly engaged, and that in fact having one marriage, it's going to open the door and clear the path for people to focus on other issues with sort of equal energy and commitment. I really think that's going to happen. But yeah, it was personal issues that got me into the movement. I grew up in Texas. I'm transgender. I was born female. I identify as a lesbian when I was a young person. Had a really awful time in high school. Was really scared, actually. I was outed to my classmates. I did not voluntarily disclose the fact that I was had a girlfriend, but that I was sort of that was discovered by my classmates, and they reacted very violently. I was threatened physically many times. The tires of my car were slashed a number of times. The young woman I was dating, someone threw a rock through the window of her house with a rubber band and a paper that said "dyke" on the rock, things like that. So I was really pretty much every day of my last year of high school, I was living in terror, really afraid of what might happen.
And then you went on to college and got involved as an activist at that point?
I did not become an activist in college. I think like a lot of other LGBT young people who go through those kind of experiences, I really internalized it. I was not angry. I was more ashamed and humiliated, and had a very difficult time accepting myself, had a very difficult time seeing any kind of future for myself, making any kind of plans. I did make it through college. I had a teacher that took an interest in me in college and encouraged me to go to graduate school, which I did for a while. And it was only much later. It was not until I was in my late 20s that I began to gain any kind of sense of equilibrium or any sense of really being able to think about the future. And then I ended up going to law school, and that for me was the real turning point when I realized then that, actually I could possibly do something with my life and maybe make a difference and help other people.
So you've a couple of times used the phrase gay rights, and you've also talked about LGBT rights. Tell us a little bit about that terminological difference. And there's yet another, which is the queer movement. Can you say a little bit about those terms and where they fit in this story?
Yes, well, when I first became a lawyer and went to work for the National Center for Lesbian Rights, which is still where I work, the concept of the LGBT movement really did not exist at all at that time. This was in the early 90s. It wasn't until really the mid to late 90s that debate happened, the debate over, wow, is there enough of an affinity between lesbian, gay, bisexual people and transgender people that we should all be in the same movement? Now, I was a lesbian identified person working for one of the big national lesbian and gay organizations when I came out as transgender and as a male in a lesbian organization. So you know what side I was on. I was like, yes, let's just stay together. This is good. We should all be together. But it was very fraught. That was by no means a foregone conclusion, and there were lots of difficult conversations, but at the end of the day, there was a very clear resolution of that question. Now it is very firmly established in the movement that it is an LGBT movement, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, and the transgender piece of that is very firmly entrenched at this point.
Can you say a little bit about the history of that process, of the joining up and the embrace by the movement of transgender people? My sense is that it was a complicated process.
It was very complicated. It was very complicated. And I'm sure different people would have different, theoretical or historical accounts of how those two movements kind of diverged in the first place. You'll often hear people talking about the fact that at Stonewall, which is kind of, considered to be the inauguration of the contemporary gay rights movement, it was drag queens and transgender women who were, kind of at the forefront of that. But, after that, the movement really, the gay rights movement developed in a way, the gay rights movement embraced a definition, I guess you'd say, of sexual orientation, or a vision of sexual orientation that was trying to normalize being lesbian or gay, and that kind of distanced itself from the notion that lesbian gay people are gender non-conforming. And for completely understandable reasons, and certainly without any animosity towards transgender people, but I do think that was at least part of the reason that sort of the transgender side of the movement kind of went on a different path. And by the 90s, the two movements were really worlds apart. And I think lesbian and gay organizations and activists really they weren't even thinking about transgender people, and they were not thinking of them as part of the same movement. But over time, the transgender movement started to kind of coalesce and become more visible, and very much wanted to be considered part of this broad sort of umbrella coalitional kind of LGBT movement. And I mean, if I do say so myself, I think we did a pretty good job of making a case for that. And we're very successful. But the reason we were successful is because the message that really resonated with so many lesbian and gay people is that the underlying roots of homophobia are so enmeshed in gender stereotypes and the same kind of gendered norms and expectations that transgender people struggle with, and I think that kind of commonality helped bring people together.
So a kind of a queer conception of gender identity, transgressive gender identity, became a kind of grounds for these two wings to come back together.
Somewhat, although I might hesitate a little bit in using the word transgressive. It's probably appropriate to some degree, but the problem I have with that word is it implies that people would choose to be transgender or choose to be gender nonconforming in an attempt to make some sort of political statement or engage in some kind of rebellion. And perhaps for some people that may actually be true, but I think for most people, it's those identities are identities that one finds oneself with, and most people really just want to find some sort of social and legal space in which they can exist and live and hopefully contribute to society and that type of a thing. So.
You've spoken powerfully about the worries that once marriage equality is achieved, there might be a kind of loss of interest in the public toward the movement. And I'm wondering if there are any particular pressing problems or challenges within the movement itself that you think are, at the forefront. And less about the way the public looks at the movement, but more within the movement itself.
There are. In contrast to how quickly and how well and how kind of thoroughly the movement has dealt with transgender people, incorporating transgender people, and sort of complicating the analysis of anti-gay prejudice and discrimination to include a very nuanced account of gender and gender-based oppression. The gay movement, the LGBT movement, has not done as well or nearly as well in incorporating issues of race and LGBT people of color. The contrast is actually pretty stark, because whereas now there are transgender people very much feel at home, I think, in the larger movement, I don't think LGBT people of color do. And I don't think the movement has succeeded sort of conceptually in terms of a kind of analytical framework or a political framework in figuring out even how to talk about issues of racial justice with the same kind of facility that people can talk about issues of gender-based injustice.
It's interesting because it seems as if, in particular with transgendered people, there's a lot of common experience of discrimination with racial minorities. I know the National Center for Lesbian Rights and your own work you've been working on the problem of employment non-discrimination, which I understand is particularly acute for transgendered people. That seems like a natural area of commonality between minority rights advocates and LGBT advocates. Am I right to suspect that?
Oh, absolutely. No, that's a really great point. I mean, we've had some interesting and I think important cases where we've tried to get at, in a more kind of concrete and sort of organic way, get at the intersection of race and gender and sexual orientation or gender identity. But for example, we represented an African American woman who's a basketball player on Penn State's basketball team, and they had this notoriously homophobic coach, Renee Portland, who had been there for years and years and would announce these policies about no drugs, no drinking, no dykes. And finally, she had just ruined the lives of several women who had played on that team who either were lesbians or she thought they were lesbians. She had hounded them off the team. And then finally, our client, Jennifer Harris, decided to really got kicked off the team because Coach Portland perceived her to be a lesbian. She was a very strong, kind of not masculine, but not conventionally feminine woman, and we really that was the first time I tried to litigate this issue, where we argued that she had been subjected to sexual orientation-based discrimination based on the perception that she was a lesbian, race discrimination based on these racial stereotypes, including stereotypes about what a woman is supposed to look like, and gender. So we alleged all three types of discrimination and tried to really flesh that out in our briefing to the court. And the case ended up settling, very successfully for our clients. So we never got a final judicial decision. But that's the kind of work where the movement needs to do. We're really just at the beginning of being able to articulate and really get at what's going on when an LGBT person of color is experiencing this uniquely toxic kind of discrimination.
Can you describe some of the other cases that you're working on now?
Yeah, another case that brings up some of these same issues that we also recently resolved successfully was this case about this great young man, Dynasty Young, who's goes to this giant high school in Indianapolis. It's like thousands of students at this school, and he had just moved to Indianapolis from Arizona, where he'd been, very happy and a very good student. He is gay. He's openly gay. He is in a, to use a word he would use it in only in a positive sense, flamboyantly gay. He likes to wear clothing that's conventionally worn by women, boots and skirts and these wonderful, outfits. And he was just mercilessly harassed at this school. Day in, day out, his mother tried to get the school to do something. They would do nothing, and she was really afraid for him. And finally, just in desperation, sent him to school with this little device called a self-protective flashlight. It makes a noise and shoots out light, and it does emit a kind of, not strong, kind of weak electric charge. And he was surrounded one day at school by a bunch of boys who were going to attack him, and he pulled the device out and set it off just up in the air, and I do believe probably saved him from an attack that would have really hurt him. But anyway, the school expelled him, blamed him. They weren't going to let him come back to school at all. Finally, they agreed after we got involved, well, we'll let him come back, but he can't come back to the regular high school. He has to go to this alternative school for kids with behavior problems, which he did not have. And so we, again, brought a case alleging multiple types of discrimination, which also successfully settled. But it was just so chilling. I mean, I felt like, if we had not been involved, that school would have just thrown away his life. And, this is part of a much bigger problem that you often hear people talk about with this school-to-prison pipeline problem, but especially with young men of color, with just the slightest infraction getting shunted off into either expelled or shunted off into schools that are not going to give anybody an adequate education. And then, your life is just, your life chances are so severely diminished. So that's another case that I feel is like really highlighting one of the most important kind of, cutting edge issues facing our community.
You've just spoken about a gay young man. What are some of the particular issues for transgendered youth?
We have a number of cases where we're representing parents with transgender students in schools, some elementary schools, middle schools, high schools. And the issue for these kids tends to be access to bathrooms, locker rooms, being able to go on overnight field trips, and being able to play on sports teams. These are really, kind of heart-wrenching cases because these young people are already kind of dealing with the challenging situation, and they just so desperately want to fit in. And lots of times schools are not trying to be punitive or unfair. They just genuinely don't know how to deal with the situation. So we often find that when we get involved and can talk to school officials, that we can explain to them the importance of letting these kids just go to school and be treated exactly the same as any other boy or girl.
Are you optimistic about the future of this particular aspect of the movement? Do you think that these schools and that transgender children that acceptance is going to come for them, as there's been this great movement about marriage equality? Do you think are you optimistic about that?
Absolutely, I am. I mean, I'll tell you something, you cannot meet one of these young people without immediately just saying, these are just sweet young kids, and school officials see that, teachers see that, and when they have their parents' support behind them, it's really just a matter of giving these schools information about how to deal with the situation. I am amazed at how much progress we're making, and it's not just on the two coasts. Some of the most supportive school officials are in places that are, more conservative. Now, this is really a human issue, and I have enormous confidence and optimism that the world is going to be a so much better place for transgender children growing up in the future.
On your NCLR profile page, there's a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. I'm an English professor, so I wanted to ask you, the quotation is, "Could a greater miracle take place than for us to look through each other's eyes for an instant?" I wanted to ask you, why is that an important quotation for you?
I do love Thoreau, and I love that quote because I do think that's the key to the law to politics and to social change is just being able to create that opportunity for just a moment of empathy and understanding of someone else's situation. And once you have that moment, I think there's really no going back, and there's no way that you're going to continue to do something to hurt another person when you understand what it feels like to be on the other side of the table.
Shannon, I'm sorry to say that we're out of time. It's been great speaking with you. Thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks, Paul.
We've been speaking with Shannon Price Minter, the legal director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights. He gave a talk titled Marriage and More, the Future of the LGBT Rights Movement as a guest of the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics on October 3rd, 2013. Thanks very much for watching.